Well, I think the Mamdani experience shows that people are hungry for a political alternative, and they're very comfortable with that political alternative calling itself democratic socialist. That in itself is a huge triumph, and I don't get why anyone would be cynical about that part of it. Now, they have more of a point when it comes to what's actually being accomplished. Well, at an organizational standpoint, we're adding 10,000 plus members to the DSA in just New York City. So New York City is a place that by the end of 2026 could have as much as 20,000 members of the Democratic Socialists of America in one city.
Welcome, everyone, to the Perspectives Journal podcast. I'm Luke Savage, a columnist at Jacobin and a writer for various other places, too. And I have the pleasure today of being joined by my colleague, Bhaskar Sankara. Bhaskar is the founding editor of Jacobin and president of The Nation magazine. He is also the recipient of the 2026 Ellen Meekson's Wood Prize, and we're recording this one day after the accompanying Ellen Wood lecture. So, Bhaskar, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for talking to me, Luke.
Bhaskar, you remarked at the beginning of your lecture last night that there is a sense in which the kind of gallows humor, I suppose, that we sometimes engage in on the left, at least, you know, since the final decades of the 20th century, you began by kind of positing that that's actually kind of misplaced, and that in some ways the story of the left in the 20th century is, at least in one sense, kind of a story of astonishing success. But the other theme of your talk was that, as you put it, both historical models of 20th century socialism, Soviet-style central planning, and social democracy were not just besieged from the outside and defeated, they failed. So I thought maybe we could begin here by talking about, I think, as you put it, the tragic success of socialism in the 20th century, tragic. First the nature of the success, and then, as you see it, and then after that, maybe we can get a little more into the failure of kind of each model.
Yeah, I think that if you look at the history of the workers' movement, and you look at the world that the workers' movement was just emerging into in the 1860s and onward, it was a world with colonialism rampant across what today we would call the global south. It was a world where industrial workers had so little that Marx had to laud the creation of the 10-hour workweek legislation in the UK as a triumph of the political economy of the working class and kind of a landmark, which was accomplishment. But these isolated and weak workers that could barely, win themselves the most basic of protections on the factory floor, and small-holding farmers and peasants who had to deal with periodic famines, encountered, were able to aggregate together their interests to the point where, if you count the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, as a whole, China, various other countries that went down the communist road, that's probably combined, 1/3 of the Earth's landmass. Then if you add in social democracy in the global north, which is also the spawn of the same, parties of the Second International that gave root to Soviet-style communism. That's probably another fifth of the world. Then you add in the experience of African socialism, of all these different Nehruvian socialism, and all these different movements that emerged out of the anti-colonial struggle. You really see that the left did not have trouble taking power. The trouble was with implementing a program once we were in power. And even there, I would describe the record as one of incomplete success with some real horrors along the way, especially when it comes to Stalinism, and with the disasters in the Great Leap Forward and other things, where socialism was kind of transformed into a developmental model. And I call it sort of the creation of a socialism outside of capitalism that was meant to catch up with and then compete with capitalism from the outside. The record in the global north, where we had social democratic parties take power in places like Sweden was more positive, but also was ultimately a failure, not because they didn't manage for a time to humanize capitalism, and not because all the gains from that period have eroded, but simply because on its own terms, the forward march of labor just, it ended. And social democracy became a means of not just managing capitalism, but managing sort of the decline of the welfare state instead of expanding it.
So let's talk about each of the models and their distinctive features and their distinctive failures as well. Let's talk about them in turn. I mean, the success that you're talking about, I suppose, happens relatively quickly by historical standards, right? You go from kind of the late 19th century where there's severe repression in places like Germany, and yet the SPD is able to become the first really genuine mass party. Similar efforts in Britain. The Labour Party goes from being formed, I think, in 1903 to having its first, albeit pretty short-lived, shot at government 20-something years later. And then, obviously there's there's the revolutionary socialism that follows the First World War. All of this happens pretty quickly. It kind of produces these two currents that we're discussing. And I suppose to begin with the latter one I just mentioned, maybe one way into this is that I think there are some people, there's a view you encounter that says that the cardinal failure of the Soviet model was really about a lack of democracy, right? So a lack of political democracy, insufficient civil liberties, repression within the apparatus of the Communist Party itself, that kind of thing. And maybe a lack of genuine economic democracy too, right? The Soviets aren't Soviet enough. There isn't enough worker participation. Instead, there's a very centralized system of economic management. And in some ways, I suppose, decades on, this is what Gorbachev is at least in theory trying to address with glasnost and perestroika. Now, you take a different view of this, really. So what are the problems with that analysis as you see it? I mean, putting aside the obvious kind of contextual dimension here, right, that there are specific conditions, historical and otherwise, that produce that give rise to something like Stalinism. Like, why wouldn't more democracy have been enough when it comes to the Soviet model?
Well, I think more democracy would have helped to some degree. It would have even helped alleviate the extent of the famines, even if you had the same collective policy, and even if somehow that collectivization had some sort of mandate. Because so much of the disasters in the Soviet Union were created by, the information being kind of stymied, the flow of information being stymied. So I think a more democratic Soviet Union, of course, would have been better. But in order for a democratic socialism to survive, the economic model itself has to be working, has to be producing a surplus, and has to have a certain level of credibility. I think the Soviet model, as it was constructed, could not have done much better than it actually did. So the Soviet model, which really takes root in the early 1930s, and before that, you could say that it was a mixed economy, at least in the NEP period, with various degrees of state control over the commanding heights of the economy, but a market sector and kind of indicative planning rather than kind of this sort of imperative sort of command style planning. But what took root from the 1930s onward managed to catch up the Soviet Union with the West in terms of heavy industry. It managed to create a base level of healthcare, a base level of education. It did certain things well. As economies got more complex, and as the number of inputs and outputs for any given good got more complex, and as the kind of global division of labor got more complex, the Soviet economy, which already had its flaws, that was able to kind of brute force its way to a certain level of better developmental outcomes, really started to suffer and stagnate. So I think a lot of the problems was with the nature of administrative planning itself. And scholars who've really looked deeply at how the Soviet economy functioned, saw that a lot of it functioned in spite of the planning. It functioned by managers sort of bartering with each other. It functioned by the plan sort of being in a constant state of revision. So the plans being, in fact, just broad directions, and then, in fact, the managers improvising and trying to make it work with their means. And, it really just failed to deliver the basics of a good life for people. And I'm not saying that what happened immediately after in the 1990s in Russia was any better. In fact, for a lot of industrial workers, it was worse.
Yeah.
But I think we shouldn't discount the fact that even today in the former Soviet Union, in places like Russia, you have a nostalgia for the stability of the system, especially among pensioners and kind of older people. But you don't have a real attempt and a push and a movement to recreate that system. So I think the whole left is basically acknowledged, in a sense, that the old system of central planning, or what I prefer to call administrative planning, failed. There's just less of a attempt to think about what could replace it.
So before we turn to the second current, social democracy, can we talk a little more specifically about the engineering problems with the administration of a command economy or of central planning? I mean, that's a big question, obviously, but you touched on it in your remarks last night.
Yeah, I think you could say that there's two broad categories of problems. The calculation problems. So essentially, you have to figure out how to coordinate a vast economy in terms of production with the inputs and outputs required by every single firm and every single input of labor that comes into production. But you also need to kind of match those outputs with consumer preferences. So the Soviet Union by the 1980s was producing 800 million pairs of footwear per year. Yet some of the longest lines in the Soviet Union were found were for people waiting for certain specialty footwear, for imported shoes and whatever else. So the Soviet Union still had to import hundreds of millions of pairs of shoes at the same time, in part because the shoes were of, to say the least, varying quality. They weren't in the right sizes. They weren't the things that people wanted to put on their feet.
Probably excessive standardization as well, right? Like there's not really like a plurality of different kinds of shoes you can choose from, which is one thing a capitalist economy, I suppose, does well. It gives you almost an excessive variety of consumer products.
Yeah, I think even though, a lot of the Soviet planners did put an emphasis from the 70s onward on, 60s onward really, on creating a variety of consumer goods. But even then, there wasn't the kind of constant like feedback loops, which is something markets do quite well. Then also the firms that were producing the shoes, the inefficient ones weren't allowed to fail. The ones that more efficiently used resources or produced outputs, had some incentives to reward their behavior, but they weren't, allowed to kind of grow and expand and kind of generalize their new techniques or innovations. So you have this problem of not only coordinating production, but also kind of matching and responding to consumer tastes. And I use kind of frivolous examples in footwear, but this is obviously, there's many more goods that are more serious, where substandard quality, has greater effects on people's lives. Then you have another category of problems with the Soviet Union that was more incentive based. So this got to some of what I was saying earlier. How do you reward firms for producing efficiently? How do you punish firms for producing inefficiently? A market system has an easy mechanism. Firms operate by hard budgets. So firms that don't bring in enough receipts to cover their expenditures go out of business. Firms that produce large surpluses and profits are able to expand and reinvest into production. So the Soviet Union, their planners knew perfectly well that this mechanism was needed at some level, but it became politically impossible to really pursue because the Soviet model was all based on stability. It was, sure, you're going to pretend to pay us and we'll pretend to work, as kind of one Soviet saying went. But, I know I'm going to have this job and I know I'm going to have these basics of things like healthcare, education for my children, social peace. And you know what? That's enough for me not to riot. I mean, that was a social compact. So it became pretty difficult to administratively remove a production unit, even if in the long run that would allow, you could create a mechanism to allow another production unit to expand and absorb that unemployment. Or perhaps you could use the state directly to redirect labor through the equivalent of what social democracies did through active labor market policies. So you kind of had that issue that led to inefficiency. You also just had managers who were, they knew that they had a set output, so they would just bargain for more and more resources to accomplish their goal just in case. I should be able to reach my output target with 3 or 4 people on the line, but let me just get 5 just in case. I should be able to produce this many shoes with this amount of leather, but let me just get a little bit more just in case. Not necessarily because they were corrupt or greedy, but often because they were bartering these extra goods to get other goods that they might have needed and kind of wasn't planned for or things like that. And of course, workers themselves had little incentive to really labor, and really a lot of the early Soviet efforts at labor productivity were moral exhortations or punishments and other stuff during the Stalinist era. And when that ended, there was various experiments that were aimed at incentivizing actions within the plan. This is purely apocryphal, but it became a joke in the Soviet Union to talk about a factory that was incentivized to produce a certain quantity of nails, so they started producing really small nails. Then when the planners say, wait, this is useless for us, they were instead incentivized on the basis of tonnage, so they just instead produced very large, useless nails, which again is somewhat, it's apocryphal, but it became a joke for a reason because it touched on a reality. And in this kind of very interconnected planned systems, if you had a factory that was inefficiently producing screws or unable to produce screws in East Germany, you could create a cascading system where one of the most advanced, East Germany had very advanced computers for the time. You could actually take your most successful kind of industrial captains and put them out of business because something downstream in the supply chain stopped working. So this is just scratching the surface of just a system that were built on inefficiency, and they really inspired some of the most brilliant planners and economists and mathematicians. Linear programming was really developed in large part in the former Soviet Union by people trying to figure out kind of an algorithmic planning to make the system more efficiently, but none of them really worked.
So we'll turn to, I guess, shortly what kind of some of the solutions to these problems as you've put them to us are. But before we do that, I want to talk about the other variety of socialism that's on the table here. Its virtues and its limitations. Obviously, with the phrase social democracy, we're painting with a pretty broad brush in historical terms, right? And in the 20th century, if you were making a list of people who called themselves social democrats, it would include Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, Ed Broadbent. It would include Tony Blair. It would include a former professor of mine who used to advise the Ontario Liberal Party on their public-private partnerships. A big tent, perhaps. But obviously what we're discussing here is mainly a variety of socialism, or broadly a variety of socialism that embraces political democracy. It's associated with the building of the welfare state. It has its origins in the workers' movements of the 19th century, particularly in Europe. And it lives on today in formations like the New Democratic Party here in Canada. I raised this in our conversation last night, but I'll repeat it again here because I think it's an important point. I mean, I think traditional social democracy is not as associated with planning as, perhaps it actually was. I brought it up last night, but the Regina Manifesto, which is the founding document of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, so the NDP's forerunner here in Canada, its foundational document had 14 points. There were 14 points to the original CCF program. The first one was planning, and this is how it began. The establishment of a planned, socialized economic order in order to make possible the most efficient development of the natural resources and the most equitable distribution of the national income. The first step in this direction will be setting up of a national planning commission consisting of a small body of economists, engineers, and statisticians assisted by an appropriate technical staff. So all of this is just to say there is some cross-pollination between these two currents that we're discussing. In any case, I mean, how would you characterize the failure of social democracy exactly? I mean, was the problem, as you see it, a contingent one? Did social democracy merely did it fail to respond adequately to the specific conditions of the 1970s? Or were the problems more structural in nature than that? And obviously, take it where you want, but I mean, it might be useful to talk about Sweden here, since I think it's already come up once or twice.
Yeah, I think that the assumption that the way to build a workers' economy was through planning was the dominant assumption from the 19th century onward. I think it's especially strong in kind of the Anglo-Canadian tradition on the left. You see this in the Labour Party approach to building a British welfare state was in a way more statist than the approach of almost any other center-left formation in Europe at the time, with the exception of the French kind of center-right, really. The Gaullist tradition was also very, very statist. And sometimes this is a good thing, and sometimes more planning is a good thing. So the NHS, if you think about it, in Britain, is a Soviet-style system. It's a system that says that no doctors and nurses should be direct state employees. No, we need to kind of develop the capacity to provide care through planning, but also ration care directly from the state. And I think it's the best system of healthcare created in the world, and that's a correct way to approach healthcare. And if the Canadian system would be working better if it was, of course, better funded, and if it followed along that road instead of the single payer road. Now, in general, though, when social democracy really became a economic success story and a political and social success story, this happened in the Nordic countries, first and foremost. It wasn't like the weaker kind of influence of social democratic thought and the weaker influence of social democrats in Canada or the UK, or much less kind of the, I guess you could call it like proto or quasi-social democratic kind of currents of the New Deal coalition. But it happened in Sweden's a great example, because Sweden, there was nearly uninterrupted social democratic rule for almost a half century up until 1976. They lost election, of course, and took back power a few years later in the early 1980s, if I recall. And in Sweden, I think they were able to figure out a few things. One, that the state could be a powerful tool of the macro economy. In Britain, it wasn't Labour that figured that out. It was the Liberals that figured that out first in many ways. But in Sweden, kind of separate from kind of the similar currents of thought elsewhere, they develop a model that said that, no, the state doesn't necessarily need to nationalize everything, but we need to use our powerful trade union federation, and we need to create a system of centralized bargaining in which a powerful trade union federation bargains with an employer federation. And we're going to use this bargaining and the excessive power of the kind of workers' movement to create a system where we benchmark wages to the median firm level, therefore allowing our most efficient firms to expand, but also forcing our least efficient producers kind of out of business. Then, of course, the efficient firms that are expanding can absorb the workers that are kind of displaced, and for workers that can't find jobs in that industry, we'll use active labor market policies. We'll use growing state employment to provide a welfare state to support them. So in many ways, it wasn't a status system primarily. It was, I would say, more left wing. It was rooted in the organized power through both this kind of system of enterprise bargaining and then also this more sectorial. It was really centralized bargaining system. Then as the system developed, the welfare state kind of grew with it. The welfare state was more kind of something that emerged in the 1960s onward and not earlier. There was also some dark sides of this kind of Swedish system. Eugenics, for example, we now associate today with Nazism in the far right, but actually emerged largely out of the progressive movement in places like the United
planning,
States.
Right?
In a way, it's
rational planning.
Yeah, in a way, it's planning. Figures like Helen Keller in the U.S., Jack London in the U.S. But in Sweden, it wasn't killing people or anything like that. But there was campaigns like forced sterilization and things like that to create a more rational and efficient society and deter antisocial behavior and other things. So I only add that caveat because a lot of we talk a lot about, rightly so, about the political deformities of the of Soviet-style communism, but they existed in just about every system. And this is one thing that those of us who believe in kind of big, grand projects of the Enlightenment should just be aware of. And I think this is one reason to incorporate aspects of liberalism into our thoughts as socialists. But the Swedish system, in the end, produced the most egalitarian system we knew. But workers did something, intuitive to me, but curious to a lot of observers at the time, including observers on the far left, who thought that the Swedish system was kind of buying off workers and neutering their inherent militancy. As workers got more secure in their workplaces, they started demanding more things, not just higher wages, but more and more power on the shop floor, more and more industrial democracy. And eventually the wage demands, the battle for industrial democracy started annoying capitalists to the point that that they were throwing up more and more acts of resistance to this kind of rising workers' movement. But still, the truce sort of held between capital and labor because, you probably would still rather, be a Swedish capitalist dealing with a predictable level of bargaining and a powerful labor movement that doesn't often go on strike compared to a French capitalist that might have a much weaker labor movement and might have to give this labor movement less of the fruits of these workers' labor, but occasionally they just don't show up for work for 4 weeks and kidnap you, every once in a while. But in Sweden, as soon as growth rates started to slow in the 1970s, as soon as the profitability of these firms are under siege, for a variety of reasons, some of them are contingent reasons like the OPEC oil shock and more international competition abroad and other things. capitalists really want to restructure firms, and they want kind of flexibility that a powerful workers movement that kind of thinks of themselves at this point as co-managing capitalist enterprises kind of are standing in their way. And you have another problem developing where, because of this model of centralized bargaining, efficient firms were paying less to their workers than they would have potentially if it was just isolated enterprise bargaining. So they were accruing excess profits. But this was part of the model the Swedish Social Democrats were developing, because the excess profits would mean more investment, which would mean the expansion of those firms. But capitalists in this environment just stopped reinvesting their excess profits. And workers at the same time in the most efficient firms felt resentful because the model was breaking down and the solidaristic wage policy was breaking down. So the second Meidner plan's idea, because the first kind of a set of arrangement was the Red and Meidner plan, but this is the second plan, just the solo album from Meidner in 1976, was let's take excess profits from these firms and let's give workers equity in the firm. And over time, the Swedish economy, firms as small as 100 employees even, over time, workers would become the primary equity holder. So that would solve both the investment problem of, we're going to take control, therefore to make capitalists invest. But it would also solve this solidaristic problem of workers feeling like they were giving up something to make the system work and getting nothing back in return. And also, obviously, it solves an ideological problem for those of us on the left, like a lot of these left-wing social democrats were, which is, we made a compromise with capitalism, but it looks like this compromise is coming to an end, so therefore we need to shift left to resolve it. Instead, that plan faced strong opposition from the capitalist class in Sweden. It faced strong opposition for even parts of the middle class in Sweden, and had lukewarm support from the social democratic leadership. So it never really came to fruition. And the solution we got to the crisis of the 1970s was the solution of third way social democracy. It was basically saying, we're going to allow capitalists to restructure production. We're going to allow capitalists to deregulate and attack unions. But those capitalists are going to unleash new avenues of growth. They're going to become profitable. Then we're going to tax them, and we're going to tax the workers that they employ, and we're going to create enough money to protect the most important entitlement programs. And especially as the population is aged, third way social democracy has been true to their promise largely. They have on the fringes pursued things like pension reform and things like that. But even in a country as right-wing as the United States, 50% of the federal budget is spent on Social Security and Medicare, and Medicaid. So it really is, I think, an accomplishment. But this was their solution out of the crisis. But I think there was a better left-wing one to pursue instead.
And I guess with third way social democracy, well, you have the additional problem, right, that it only works as long as there's a surplus to keep skimming and reinvesting, right? So if capitalism retrenches, and that's great in the 1990s because, there's these huge windfalls from all these recently privatized public assets. There's the economy's in a boom period. And as soon as that breaks down, you just get austerity, don't you?
Yeah, that's true of any form of social democracy, right? Any form of social democracy needs growth, needs profitable firms. And in and of itself, that's the built-in break in the system. It's also the thing that workers intuitively understand. They know that they need a profitable firm to work at to survive. And governments know that they need profitable firms employing workers in order to have a tax base to continue to kind of reproduce itself and to fulfill vital social functions. So there's no kind of moralistic appeal out of this problem. The need is to construct a road from social democracy to a democratic socialism that socializes the investment function. So we're no longer reliant on private capitalists for our jobs and also for future expansions in the economy.
Okay, yeah. So let's turn directly to that, to the alternative that you're proposing. And here I actually want to quote something that my late friend Ed Broadbent wrote that may be useful here. This was in 1991. Ed Broadbent wrote the following. This was in a piece, I believe originally for Dissent magazine, called Some Thoughts on Socialism. Quote, "Just as there are gradations in the development of democracy that entitle us to say that some countries are more democratic than others, so too are there gradations in socialism that entitle us to say some nations are more socialist than others. And just as capitalism retains certain elements of feudalism, so too will any form of socialism retain elements of capitalism." Now, there's a certain ambiguity to this passage in isolation because the word gradation is obviously pretty load-bearing, what constitutes a gradation either of socialism or capitalism. But I put this on the table because I think Ed was gesturing at something that at least resembles or is, kind of in the same direction of travel as what you're discussing. And, here I'm going to just repeat myself from last night. In our conversation, I put to you that there's kind of an either-orism that you often find. I think you find it on the left. You also find it, I think, among a lot of the left's critics as well. There's a view that there are really two poles to the left-wing imagination, and you can kind of have, one or the other political project. You can have, and each is associated respectively with the two models we've been discussing, right? So you can have a system that rejects, really embraces the state, embraces planning. So it rejects the institutions we associate with capitalism, private ownership of the means of production, market incentives, and so on, in which case you have inefficiency and potentially authoritarianism as well. That's one option. Or you can have a form of social democracy that has a mixed economy. There's some measure of public ownership. There is a system of social protection of various kinds, hopefully universal. There may be cash transfers and other redistributive institutions, that kind of thing. But you still have private profit, and that in turn, means, if you're a critic of this from the left anyway, that you still have the distributive outcomes of capitalism. You still have the kind of possessive individualism that comes with capitalism, and at that point, aren't you really just talking about a variety of capitalism that may be preferable to the kind of rip and run model, but you're still talking about a variety of capitalism. So those, I think, are broadly those are the contours of how this discussion often plays out. But I think as maybe Ed was getting at in that passage I read, and as you're getting at in your what you said just now and in your remarks last night, you are really rejecting this dichotomy. So You're putting forth the view, I suppose, that it's possible in some sense to have a form of market socialism that maybe retains certain institutions and mechanisms we associate with the market, but does not breed the kind of market dependency in which a society's social relations are determined by and structured around the logics of the market. So, is that an apt characterization to you? I mean, how would you kind of delineate the model?
Well, I would agree with Ed that in what he wrote, that there's varieties of capitalism, and some varieties of capitalism are more socialist than others. Some have been influenced by the workers' movement, or been influenced by a Christian democracy that's been influenced by a workers' movement, and so on. And in my view, the more socialistic varieties of capitalism, as long as they're able to meet the basic needs of people and produce enough economic surplus, are always preferable to the less socialistic ones. It's hard to get more socialist than a country like Sweden that was governed by avowed socialists for a half century in a row. But ultimately it's still it was socialists governing a capitalist system. It was doses of socialism within capitalism. Where I would disagree somewhat is I do think there is a sharp break. There is a moment of rupture. There is a point where you know it when you kind of see it, when you go from capitalism to socialism. And I think the distinction is what you've already got it, and a distinction that's in Ellen Wood's Origin of Capitalism and elsewhere, which is capitalism is not the first system with a market. Markets existed before capitalism, but capitalism is the first system that's characterized by market dependence, where production for the market becomes the all-consuming task of mankind. And it seems natural that there could be a model of socialism that incorporates markets, that also makes inroads against market dependence, but also doesn't have a capitalist class. And to me, that's when you're in socialism. And I do think that there is kind of a moment of rupture, even if your socialism is achieved through parliamentary means, but a moment of rupture where it's very clear that this is the day that the capitalists are expropriated, or this is the day we start the gradual expropriation of capital, and we'll know it when we see it, in much the same way that we knew when the end of slavery was, even in systems that gradually emancipated, as opposed to emancipating through a revolution like in the United States.
And so, I mean, what you're talking about here is, I suppose it may ring to some people as, are you really just saying that there should be, there should be a form of social democracy that has more economic democracy or something? So, is this really just we need more industrial democracy, more worker participation in firms? We need perhaps legal reforms that make, that give designated legal or perhaps even constitutional, status to worker-owned firms, or what you're talking about, I think, is somewhat more, somewhat beyond that.
Yeah, what I would say is that the road to socialism, in my mind, runs through social democracy. It's not opposed to social democracy. So certainly it looks at what is built by social democracy, and it just asks, how do we make this sustainable? How do we make this less hierarchical? How do we make this more egalitarian? So in that sense, if you take your existing public sector and you just expand it, you would be fulfilling the old social democratic and socialist dream of kind of nationalizing the commanding heights of the economy. I think there's plenty of extra spheres of the economy, especially natural monopolies like rail and telecommunications and things like that, that should be nationalized. I think there's other spheres that we've already seen works quite well with very traditional planning mechanism, like healthcare, as we've seen with the National Health Service, for instance. So in that sense, okay, that wing of what you want to do sounds like a social democracy on steroids. When it comes to the private sector, though, this is where the distinction is really different, because the private sector is a realm of tyranny within capitalism, at least from the perspective of a socialist. There's no workplace democracy. There is certain rights guaranteed by the state or guaranteed by collective bargaining agreements, but ultimately capital kind of calls the shots and kind of decides when to invest, when to create jobs, when to close a business. It decides within legal norms what one can do with your 40 hours or 35 hours on the work day. And it's here where I would like to see this sort of commodity producing sector be turned into the equivalent of worker cooperatives, where workers control their production on the shop floor, where workers still try to meet the needs of consumers, where they still try to kind of accumulate within the rules of the market profit, but where they elect their own management and they kind of govern themselves. Further, I think there is an issue if you just have individual sets of workers owning their own firms. You would have a ton of problems, one of which is it would distort the economy because it would create a situation where workers try to jump to the most capital-intensive fields. So wouldn't we all want to work on an oil rig because there's only a handful of people working there? If you haven't tell, I have never been on an oil rig, but only a handful of people working there. But it mostly is the machinery, the dead labor that's producing the profits and natural resources. One reason why the critique of the Gotha program, Marx attacks the Lassallean sort of idea that labor is the fruit of all wealth. Where he says, what about nature? What about other factors of production? But you rather work there, and you wouldn't want to work in a daycare clinic or something like that, which is just as socially valuable as kind of energy production. So there's that reason, but there's also just the broader reason that, to some degree, social wealth should belong to the broader public. So how do you balance the two sort of demands of worker control in a syndicalist way and the more kind of planned economy thinking of, well, social wealth is social wealth, so it needs to be used for the benefit of the entire community, not just those lucky few that are sorted into the right industries. And I think that comes from essentially letting workers keep the dividends of profit from their workplaces, but letting the means of production be owned by the state through its intermediaries and public banks that are, in charge of both assisting kind of the worker cooperatives, but also in charge of some key decisions around investment. So in either case, you now can't describe this private sector as actually being private if it's socially owned. So, but there is still that distinction, public-private distinction. You can see the contours of social democracy in this new system, but I would just call it two socialized spheres. One would be the non-commodity producing sort of more planned sphere, and the other being the commodity producing a socialized sphere.
So there's a lot more we could discuss there, but it'll get a little nerdy and technical, and I think we're a little short on time. So I would just direct everybody watching and listening to Bhaskar's lecture, which he gave last night, which you can find on the Broadbent Institute's YouTube channel, and also to the forthcoming book he's written with his colleagues. Mike Beggs and Ben Burgess. That's called The Blueprint, and I believe it'll be out this September. A lot more detail in that. Bhaskar, in the time we have left, I want to shift gears a little bit. One of the sources of strength, I suppose, of the socialist renaissance that we've seen since the 2010s that Jacobin has obviously played a leading role in, which we saw around the two Bernie campaigns. These things have been powered in a way by an influx of, it's millennials, but it's a particular kind of millennial. It's educated but downwardly mobile, people who, I suppose, in a sense, are culturally middle class, if not in the sense of property ownership or bank balance or things like that. And so, in some ways, right, this has been the vanguard, and it's also been one of the weaknesses and the limitations of the socialist renaissance since the 2010s and of left-wing populism in general. We're still too urban. We're still too middle class. There's been an inability sometimes to broaden the appeal of this project beyond, sufficiently. It's been broadened somewhat, but sufficiently beyond those things I just mentioned. And that's been coterminous in obvious ways with a broader pattern of class de-alignment we've seen with, vis-a-vis parties like the Democrats, where there's been a conscious shift since the late 1980s, to this more kind of patrician orientation, to affluent professionals with college degrees, basically. But historically, from the left anyway, it's been the working class that has been, viewed as the principal agent, in fact, the necessary agent of political change. And I think it might be useful to those watching and listening if we engage the question directly, why the working class? There are some people who I guess might say, they might look at this and they might say, well, the old industrial working class is gone. And so with it, we've also lost the conditions for the kind of political mobilization, the kind of political consciousness that was associated with. So why continue to think in these terms at all?
Yeah, I think for one, the appeal to the working class wasn't just sort of a moral appeal of these people are poor and downtrodden and exploited. It was also a strategic appeal that said that these people who happen to be the poor, downtrodden, and exploited are, as a result of their exploitation, actually at the center of production. There's almost something kind of beautifully, messianic sort of about it. You could easily imagine how the last can become, first, if the first are locking the last up with all these expensive, machineries and putting them at the center of world economic progress. So because of their position in the point of production, workers had this ability to withhold their labor or go on strike, or potentially the ability to take over their factories or other kind of places of work. And I still think that mechanism still broadly holds. If you look at, let's say, car production in the last 10 years in the United States is producing more cars than ever. As countries move up the value chain, obviously you rely more on dead labor. You rely more on machinery rather than living labor. So the share of employment in these professions have gone, but the leverage of those workers has not gone. So in a way, I would say I would rather have the allegiance of 10 well-positioned workers, they have more leverage at least, than 100 or 1,000 of us left-wing Jacobin readers in Brooklyn that are scattered across industries. Because our power that we exert is a power that we exert in civil society or as citizens largely, rather than at the point of production. Obviously, it'd be great to have both, right? Now, obviously, the economy is also getting more complex. So this kind of old school 19th century Marxist vision of a simplification of class relations has not happened, right? We're not just becoming a mass of proletarians and then the capitalist class. These intermediary classes have survived, not the peasantry. So they were actually right about what classes they thought was disappearing. But there's, this is why I rely so much on Eric Olin Wright's kind of view of class structure. These kind of intermediary class locations of, let's say, a highly skilled worker who has more autonomy on the job as a result of their skill, or a professional white-collar worker who has more autonomy but still doesn't own the means of production, or a bodega owner in New York City who has basically no autonomy but actually is an owner, right? So you actually see this fragmentation and the need to make sure that your appeals work to multiple different groups of people at the same time. That's why I don't love the discourse, including among some Jacobin contributors and others, of just lamenting the PMC and lamenting sort of, first of all, there's no such thing as professional managerial class. It doesn't exist as a class. It's a contradictory class allocation, and there's a big difference between, let's say, the physician assistants and other people that Barbara and Reich, and John probably had in mind when they were coming up with this theory. And let's say the someone who's a CEO at Pepsi Cola or something. But so I think we should respond to these kind of changing conditions and make sure that our appeals can reach even segments of the working class that are forced to get more education and more credentialization to survive. But where there becomes a real trade-off is, who do you primarily orient your appeal towards? Again, I would love to have everyone, but I would primarily orient my appeal towards blue-collar workers and certain other segments of the workers in service sectors like teachers and nurses and so on. The reason why I think that your orientation matters is because when it comes to language, culture, what's the most important issue to you, there will be divergences between your higher income, kind of middle strata, and more ideologically left supporters, and your kind of working class base. This will also be true of rural divides, right? So when you have a populist candidate like Dan Osborne campaigning in Nebraska, he'll campaign on demands like the right to repair. So if you have a John Deere tractor, you shouldn't just have to take it to a service center. You should be able to open it up without voiding your warranty, things like that. I don't know a single leftist in Brooklyn that would oppose that demand, but it definitely would not have come to them, or organically. I also do think there's a certain language when we talk about even thorny issues. So Osborne, and he's no socialist, but when he's at a rally filled with people, a lot of them who support Donald Trump, and he's asked about his immigration policy because he was accused of being an open borders guy. He says, and for the record, I am basically an open borders guy. I think it should be a quick stamp, and you should be free to move through. But Osborne's reply was, of course I don't support open borders. I support a strong, secure border. But when I look at what Trump is doing, it's crazy. They're deporting hardworking, our friends and neighbors who are hardworking, who didn't do anything wrong. They're separating mothers from their children. I can't support, that. We have to have a fair policy for these people. And the crowd, which is in many ways a right of center crowd in Nebraska, are all applauding. Mm-hmm. To me, that's effective and smart politics, and that's how you actually move the country in a more positive direction. And you can take a host of very thorny, culture war issues, though that's more of a material issue, and you could find ways to kind of connect with. In kind of a majoritarian way, and also just simplify your program so it doesn't become, this is like a very, I hate the term, but a very PMC thing where, you think of yourself through 80 identities all at once, and you kind of demand that your candidates support all 80 of your most important issues. Whereas, like the New Laborites did, they basically simplified their platform, and they put it on the back of the membership card, like Zoran Mamdani did with affordability, like Lenin did with his call for, land, bread, and peace. We have to run on just a few things, and obviously, we care about the struggle against oppression of all its types, but to win elections, to win power, we need a certain simplification and focus, and I feel like that is one potential problem with today's left.
Well, that actually pairs nicely with the question I wanted to close on. I think if we look at the most successful current efforts of the contemporary left, so, the Mamdani project in your city, for example, what they tend to be pursuing, at least in programmatic terms, I think most closely or more closely matches traditional social democracy as we've characterized it than anything going beyond it, right? So the Mamdani program in policy terms is about things like universal childcare, free transit, freezing the rents in the places where the city is in a position to do that. It's working squarely within, the fine American tradition of sewer socialism that I guess I associate with places like Chicago and Milwaukee, or I guess in Mamdani's case, it's more like pothole socialism, but same basic idea. So yeah, I mean, how does the Mamdani project, as you see it, how does it kind of fit in everything we've been discussing, and what do you think the possibilities are, given the program I just alluded to, for the kind of expanded political horizon that socialists should be pursuing? Is something like that inchoate here? Might something like that come out of it, because there might be people, there are already some people, right, who are looking at this and they might say some version of, well, hey, this is obviously better than like DNC liberalism, but is it really socialism? And they're the most cynical among them might say, is an organization like DSA, which is obviously very associated with the Mamdani campaign, isn't it just investing itself in something reformist and non-transformative? So how would you respond to that?
Well, I think the Mamdani experience shows that people are hungry for a political alternative, and they're very comfortable with that political alternative calling itself democratic socialist. That in itself is huge, a huge triumph, and I don't get why anyone would be cynical about that part of it. Now, they have more of a point when it comes to what's actually being accomplished. Well, at an organizational standpoint, we're adding 10,000 plus members to the DSA in just New York City. So New York City is a place that by the end of 2026 could have as much as 20,000 members of the Democratic Socialists of America in one city, obviously, albeit a very big city. So there is that sort of interest in the left, interest in socialism, interest in socialist organizations that's developing, and that we could credit Zoran directly for. Now, when it comes to the idea of is the program actually transformative, I would say no. Right now, the program is not actually transformative in a social sense. The program is promising good governance, and it's promising measures to address an affordability crisis. In that sense, it's a good program, and I support it wholeheartedly. But there's very few aspects to the program that you could say is inherently leading or snowballing to something more radical. And we each have to decide whether and how to critique Zoran. I would say that there's not necessarily a big base of mobilized workers demanding something more transformative. He's also dealing with an inherited deficit in the billions that makes it difficult to do more transformative things as well. But I think that would be a fair criticism of what Zoran is doing in practice. I would say it's a limit of a socialist governing one city, and it doesn't really reflect a broader lack of vision or ambition on DSA's part. But I would love New York City to pursue things that don't cost anything but are in fact quite socialist, like encouraging the creation of neighborhood consultory assemblies, expanding and democratizing participatory budget efforts. So it's not just the domain of upper middle class people who have too much time on their hands, and a host of other things to encourage the creation of cooperatives in New York City and things like that would in fact be at least show that there's a difference between socialist municipal government and progressive governance.
Well, there's so much more that we could discuss here, but I think regrettably we're out of time, so we'll have to leave it there. Bhaskar, thank you very much. Again, for all of you watching and listening, do check out Bhaskar's lecture on YouTube, the 2026 Ellen Meekson's Wood lecture. Find his work in Jacobin, The Nation, all over the place. Many thanks as well to the Broadbent Institute, the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, and to Toronto Metropolitan University supporting the lecture. And thanks again to you, Bhaskar.
And thanks to you, Luke. Thanks for the conversation.